So now let's turn to Gaylord, Gill, and Randy Bosscher. They're doing the build along with Art's Bar Mills 1 kit. Now this is totally different. It's called a kit, but it's really some bits and pieces, and you can make of it what you want. This is awfully close to scratch building, about as close as you can get without it being 100% scratch built model. So Gaylord, I appreciate you bringing this to everybody's attention. I certainly appreciate you and Randy spending the time and effort you have making this possible. I really appreciate you sending me the email from one of the modelers who's building along with you. His comments about what he is gaining from this process, to me, justifies a lot of the effort that everybody is putting forward in it. So far, I have not received any negative comments from any of the build-alongs, but I really appreciate a modeler taking the time and effort to send you the email that you shared with me. So Gaylord, Randy, I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you, Jim.
Good evening.
I will get my shared screen going. So Randy and I have decided we will share the presentations in turn. I'm going to present tonight. Randy will handle the presentation next week, and we'll go back and forth. We are doing the 1 kit, as Jim has said. And our first slide already has been shared with you by Jim as well. And that is if you mark May 29th, that is going to be our show and tell for the models that you're building with the 1 kit. And we have a single $25 gift certificate provided by Bar Mills, the manufacturer of the kit. And we will do a random draw, but you have to have a model on the table to be eligible. So we hope that you guys will all follow through with this. When we did a straw poll a few weeks ago, we saw about 10 hands that indicated people were planning to do the build of the 1 kit. And that was a mix of folks in HO, S, and O scale, which is really kind of neat. Just to remind you of the project timetable, we've done 2 intro sessions. We're now sitting at build number 1 of 4 sessions. Each of these will be just a week apart. So we had a lot of downtime between the intro and tonight, but we're going to go once a week now. So last time in March, we asked you to draw up plans that reflect what your project is going to look like, and to obtain the additional materials beyond what the kit provides to complete your project. So I'll ask at this time, are there any questions or issues with that assignment from last time? You can either speak up or put something in the chat. So the topics for tonight, we're going to talk about how to lay out the wall cuts, unlike the project that Bob just shared with you where the walls are pre-cut. We need to do our walls according to your plan. And then we are going to lay out the door and window placements that will reflect your project. And we have some considerations that we'll talk about for your foundation, the painting, and if you're going to do it, the lighting. So Randy's project that he's going to be building along is a pool hall. And here is a plan view. Let's make sure everybody understands terminology, architectural terms. When we talk about plan view, that is the classic bird's eye view. I guess today we would call it a drone's eye view, looking down on the structure. Randy's laid out a couple of challenges for himself. He's got an entryway here that has some walls that will not be at right angles. He has an L on the back of the building. that is going to introduce an interior corner, a little different than the conventional exterior corners. And the L roof will have to intersect the main roof. So also another little challenge. And here's the other term that we'll be using, elevation view, looking full on to the wall. He's got some details here that we will talk about as we go through tonight. And I had shared with you before that I had already built a bar and grill from this one kit, and I've taken lots of intermediate photos during that build. So we'll use examples from both of these models as we go through to illustrate our points. Now, when you're working with your plan, obviously everyone's got a different plan because of the way this kit is designed. There's some pluses and minuses of the one kit we should talk about. Those etched guidelines that are on the back of the wall panels for the doors and the windows are a great help, but it might be that you can't use the doors and window guidelines as is. On my bar and grill, on the front second story, I was following a prototype photo that showed 3 equally spaced windows, but the spacing was wider than what the one kit would have built. So I effectively had to move 2 of my windows. One I could use exactly as planned, as the guidelines show. These 2 had to be moved. It turns out the third window, I got to use the guidelines on the side, but I cut away the part that normally would have been left intact. But that gave me the 3 evenly spaced windows. You might have to do something similar with your build. It also might be that you're not going to be able to use one of the factory edges, depending on how your windows lay out on the wall in your project. You might be making some cuts at both ends of the wall. So let's talk about wall cuts. We're going to recommend that you lay all of your marks for the cuts that you will be making, lay that out directly on the back of your wall panels and start right out with marking which wall this is. Here it says back wall, so that will help keep track as you're proceeding which wall you're talking about, and we'll show you what specifics we are recommending you put on that. Just some real basics, but because we are not working with laser cut parts, the old carpenter's adage of measuring twice, cut once is apropos here. Be careful with your measurements. In this digital age where you get awful used to using that undo button, but if you cut one of your walls a 1/16 inch too short, that's hard to undo. We really recommend getting all of your measurements into one format. Either work with a prototype ruler, so you're taking your measurements directly in prototype feet, or work with the actual model dimensions as you've converted prototype feet into scale inches. So stick with one. Doesn't matter which, whatever you're more comfortable with, but do everything with one ruler or the other. And we recommend marking everything in pencil before cutting. Ask me why that's a good idea. I think we've all had cases where we've made an inappropriate cut, but it's a lot easier to erase a pencil line, easier than to undo a cut.
Very important. Remember, everything is backwards when you're doing this layout.
Yep, good point, Randy. I'll mention that again coming up, but that's exactly right. Obviously, all cuts need to be straight. I hope everybody's using good straight edge, using sharp blades. It's especially important when you're making cuts with the grain. Here is a case where we might be cutting the wall to the appropriate height that we want. We recommend doing all of these basswood cuts with several passes. Don't try to dig in so deep that you're only going to do it in 2 cuts. Make several passes. Your initial cuts, keep that edge tight, slightly into the straight edge, get a groove started, and then complete your cuts. When we're cutting square cuts, now we're looking at cutting one of these walls to the appropriate length. Make sure you're using a good square. It's a good idea periodically to check from both sides of the piece. Here, the barrel of the square is at the top of the piece. Make a scribe mark, flip that over, lay it against the bottom of the piece. That helps you verify 2 things. One, that your tool is properly squared, and also that your piece you're working with has 2 parallel edges. We suggest you want to plan ahead for your corner joints. The length of the wall that we're measuring has corner trim at both ends. Now, the dimensions could be worked with just with the wall length itself, but the key is always make sure that your opposite walls are identical lengths and heights. Now, in a rectangular building, that's going to be more obvious and more easy to do. The front wall and that back wall need to be identical length and height. Randy's build is going to be a little tougher because of the L, but obviously the sum of this wall segment and this wall segment has to still equal the length of the back wall. Let's look at how these corner joints are going to work. We're going to talk a lot more about this next week, but unlike the kit that Bob shared earlier with all these nice interlocking pieces, our walls, once we cut them, are going to have these. This is another plan view looking down on it. Here we have our 2 clapboard walls, 2 adjacent walls. We're going to put some interior bracing in the inside corner and this visible corner trim on the outside corner. And we gotta get all of these lined up properly, but we're going to show you a neat technique next week on how to do that. That interior corner we mentioned on Randy's build, you may not have one of these, but this is how you would do it. Here's those same 2 clapboard pieces, but now we're looking at the outside surfaces, the exterior. We're still going to have that piece of corner trim in the corner, but only a tiny bit of it will be visible on the outside. And our interior bracing is going to be typically 2 pieces that are overlapped. The reason we're mentioning this in the terms of wall cuts, if you want to have a very precise measurement of your wall dimensions, here's a neat technique that we'll share with you. It takes 4 steps here. Let's say we're going to cut this wall to be 24 prototype feet long. And I'm going to use this edge as our reference point. So we lay the 24 feet out. If you hold that ruler down and now set your square right at the end of that, and then hold the square firmly, take the ruler away, we're going to lay 2 pieces of corner trim next to the square, tight to the square, and mark that line. Mark that on the wall. That represents the amount of the wall panel that's contributing to this 24 feet. And the 2 pieces of corner trim, one at each end of that same wall, make up the rest of the 24 feet. So where you've made that mark, that is where you'll make your cut through to create that section of wall. That's to get the most precise measurement. If your structure is not quite that, you don't care to hit exactly that length, you could kind of ignore your corner pieces and just cut your walls to the rough length. And as long as they are equivalent to the opposite wall, you're in good shape. There's some considerations for your gable ends. Okay, here again, we are now looking at, in Randy's case, the front and this back wall that are underneath the main roof. Typically, the pitch or the slope on both sides of that will be the same, although that's not always necessary, or the case, not always the case. You could have a more steeply pitched one side, but typically they're going to be equivalent. And again, you typically want this piece to be a mirror image of its corresponding wall on the back. And you could see in Randy's case, he's had to allow this extra segment on this side of this back wall to complete the L. And obviously that's not part of what the front wall has, but this part of the gable part that's underneath the main roof, those two need to be the same. And you can test that by putting the backs of the two walls together, and all these lines should line up, the bottom edge and the two pitched edges. There's one other consideration about gable ends, and this is maybe a little bit difficult to see, but here we're showing an elevation view of the gable, the eventual roof panel we're gonna add to it, and the adjacent wall, which you're just seeing the edge of. The ideal cut, when we're talking about the height of the walls, the ideal cut is along these red lines. I'm cutting out my gabled wall here. You'll see that that makes that edge slightly higher, slightly taller than the height of the wall that it's adjoining. And that's because of this slope, because of this pitch. If you don't allow that, and if you cut your gabled piece to be exactly the same height as the adjacent piece, you will wind up with a gap when you put this together. Now, that may not be a problem at all, because typically we're going to lay some trim pieces underneath here, or we might beef up the thickness of the roof piece to represent rafters. But kind of watch for that as you're laying out your gable ends adjacent to your adjacent wall. Let's talk about doors and windows. Here's the point Randy just made, that we are now going to transfer to the backs of our wall panels everything that's specified in our plan in terms of the window and door placements. So this is now, we're looking at it from the back, so everything's reversed. If your structure had a door to the left end as you're facing from the outside, it's now going to appear to be on the right end. We recommend first marking these out before you cut them. Mark with an X the part that you're going to be removing. I hope by now, as you've looked at the kit, you've thought about the height that you want for your windows. If you recall, the kit gives us what we would call a 10 light window, 10 small panes. And if you cut out all of the 5 knockouts, as I call them, that would fit that frame, the entire frame. For my bar and grill, I wanted 2 large panes in each window. So I needed to remove some of the mullions and muttons inside and create what would have been 4 small panes. I made 1 large pane. Here's the second large pane. And then I whacked off and did not use the last 2 panes worth. Whatever your plan calls for, you're going to have to decide how to do that, how many of the knockouts to cut out for the type of window that you want. But that'll be individual to your build. And also when you're cutting out your door openings, you might think about, are you going to have a threshold in that door space? You might need to allow a little bit extra for that. In other words, cut your door opening a slight bit higher for that.
Gaylord, can I ask you a question here?
Absolutely, yep.
Going back to that previous photo you had of the windows and the panes,
Yep.
do you have any tips for cutting the panes out? I mean, it looks like to me that would be awfully delicate work.
It is. You're essentially having to follow the inside edge of this thing and just nip it away. I would recommend doing it fairly much freehand, but cutting it not. Don't try to get your cut exactly where you want it to end up, but cut it a little bit away from that frame, and then carefully dress it with a small file or piece of sanding stick.
Thank you.
Okay, when we are cutting on the guidelines, we still would recommend using a straight edge. Don't try to cut them freehand. Here's a little tip that Randy's used before, and I hadn't seen it, but it's a good idea. Because we're working with wood, because it's got grain and it tends to potentially splinter. He lays some tape down just outside each of the 4 corners, and it just kind of helps control the grain splitting as we're cutting these cuts. You want to always start in the corner, get your tip into the corner and pull away from the corner. And we recommend first doing those cuts that are against the grain, cross grain, because if you think of it, a knife blade, even as thin as this is, it's kind of like a farm plow going through the earth. It's pushing to both sides. So cut across the grain first, and then when you cut these with the grain, you're less likely to go past your corner point. We're going to suggest, again, several cuts. And if you keep cutting a little at a time until the knife blade just nicks through to the front surface, then flip it over and complete your cuts from the front, and you'll be less likely again to chip away any of your wood from the presentation side. If you have any unusual foundation requirements, you should think about that as you're cutting out your walls. It's not likely your project would, but in my bar and grill project, you might recall I had a side street that was going on a grade. And so I had to notch out the bottom of my wall for that. So just think about your foundation and see if there's anything that you might find unique about the cutting out of the walls. Bob already identified the importance of painting before you do your final assembly. There's nothing wrong with building the entire structure first and doing your painting, but you're making it awful hard on yourself. If you have different colors that you're planning for your walls versus your corner trim versus your windows and doors, your foundation, of course, will be different color. It is much more simple to build these first as sub-assemblies and paint them before you do your final assembly. And if you're going to do lighting, kind of map out how you expect to light your structure, if you're going to do any individual rooms. where the lights actually will be. You can mark those right on your plan as well, or sorry, right on your wall panel as well. Map out where your wiring will go, where your power source will be for lighting. Obviously, the goal is that you have no bulbs or wires seen through the windows. And here's an example of a build that Randy did before, that all the wiring nicely gathered, held together with some dabs of glue, a single place where it is channeled down. This leaves this all open to be a freight door that is fully open and exposing the interior, but everything is tucked away to the side. I also point out a really neat feature that Randy proposes for all structure lighting. He's got a couple of surface mount LEDs here, but they're on a beam positioned in a way that they're shining upward, and he colors the underside of his roof panels a light color or white color, so that the light bounces off that white surface. It diffuses it really nicely. There are no real hot spots here. It's a great technique. This is just kind of a recap of these construction steps that we've identified today. We will add to these in future sessions, so you'll get kind of a master list of the order. Although I will say there's nothing wrong with doing these in different orders. Different people have different techniques that work for them. This is an order that we propose. So here are your assignments for next time. Cut your walls out to your plan. Cut out your door openings and your window openings. It's going to get real now. We're going to actually get started on doing our cuts. And once again, if you have any issues, need some help, here's a couple of email addresses for us, and we'll be happy to help you out. Randy, anything that I missed that you picked up on?
No, I think we're well covered. On the demonstration of how to precisely cut the walls and allowing for the corner pieces, if anybody is in need of a method to center those door and window cutouts, the system that was shown, the 4 pictures on one page, essentially you can use that same thing to center them. Okay, great. Thank you, Gaylord. Essentially, all we're going to do is work from the center out. Or right now, you see the illustration is working from one end to the other of the wall panel. And that's fine for a straight wall. But if you have a critical need, like, okay, let's do an example here. You take the 3 window openings or cutouts that are under the ruler at the moment. So let's assume we want to keep those 3, but we want them to be centered in your end wall. So let's assume the same 20-foot wall. We're going to first find the center of those 3, which is easy enough to do in this case. Then slide your scale to the 10-foot mark instead of 20-foot, and then basically repeat the whole system. The only difference is now put 1 piece of trim before you make your mark, because then we're going to flip the wall around left to right and do the whole thing again. In other words, again, measure from the center 10 feet out, take 1 piece of trim off, and now you'll have that all nicely centered. So it's the same thing, just work from the center out instead of from the right to the left.
Good.
Oh, one quick note too on the window cutouts. This may be endemic just to the S-scale kit. I don't know, but be aware that you may have to adjust the windows, the openings of the windows or for the windows to fit the final size of your sashes. You know, mine do not exactly fit. So just something to keep an eye on. It's very easy to adjust, obviously, but something to check for.
It's interesting because mine worked perfectly. When I did my build,
I
they
know.
worked perfectly.
So, yeah, Gaylord had a very early version of this kit, and there were a number of differences to the one that I have. There's none of
Any
that
other
may be
questions?
true in case of the HO or the O scale ones either. We do not know. So,
Any other questions?
I have
Jim,
a
I guess.
question.
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering what is the thickness of your walls?
the ones in the S scale kit are 1/16 of an inch thick.
1/16?
Yes.
Do you have a different experience with your kit?
No, not whatsoever.
Okay.
Guys, it's Court Cooning. One little suggestion when you do the walls or the cutout for the windows. If you take a little drill 76 or so and drill into the four corners, it'll stop that splitting for you.
Good.
Yeah, obviously basswood has very little strength parallel to the grain.
Yeah. And it's a shame because it's having designed and cut out kits. And Greg will probably say the same thing. It's very hard to do an orientation where you're not getting that because, there's only so many ways you can orientate parts on a sheet.
Sure. And obviously, if you're doing scribe siding or something, you're going to have to go with the grain anyway. So you're quite right.
Yep.
Yeah, it's particularly a problem. Earlier in the thing, we showed a very short wall with two window cutouts. Well, the outside edge of that is less than 1/4 of an inch from the end of the wall. So you do want to be careful. So.
Yeah.
But glue works
It's
too.
amazing how many times that little, and in smaller scales, it becomes a lot smaller, that space between a door and the end of the wall.
Oh, yeah. I don't even want to imagine what that'd be in N scale.
It's called, we'll glue it back together.
Yeah, totally agreed. So,
I hate rework, but everything is fixable. If you mess something up, it can be fixed.
Well, you guys are worried about HO scale. They do have T scale. What is that, 1:450 or something?
Z scales, the really small one I'm aware of.
do those sets come with a magnifying glass?
He is like half the size of Z scale.
I'm reminded of the very early television sets when they used to sell a Fresnel lens that you would put in front of it that hopefully made the set look bigger.
Yeah. Well, Gaylord, Randy, thank you so much tonight. Really do appreciate it. And
Sure.
as you say, if anybody has any questions after they've started cutting out their walls or windows and doors, you've given them your email address. Please contact them and you'll get some help in a return email. So guys, thank you so much for doing this. I really do appreciate it.